You have probably had your blood drawn at some point in your life. Perhaps you sat in a sterile clinic chair, rolled up your sleeve, and watched a nurse slide a needle into your arm. Perhaps you looked away. Perhaps you counted the seconds while a tube filled, one tube, then another, then a third. You handed over something intimate, something biological, and you trusted entirely that the result you received days later was true. That trust is the foundation of medicine. Without it, a diagnosis means nothing. A treatment plan means nothing. The entire relationship between a patient and their doctor collapses. Now imagine that the result you received was wrong. Not wrong through honest error, not wrong because technology failed in some unforeseen way, but wrong because the people running the laboratory already knew the machine did not work, and they sent out the result anyway. That is the story of Theranos. At its peak in 2014, the company was valued at $9 billion. Its founder, Elizabeth Holmes, was named the youngest self-made female billionaire in United States history. Her company promised to run more than 200 blood tests. Tests for cancer, for HIV, for diabetes, for heart disease, using nothing more than a few drops of blood collected from a fingertip. No needles, no multiple tubes, no long waits. A tiny device, small enough to sit on a pharmacy counter, would change medicine forever. The company had over 800 employees. It operated testing centers in 40 Walgreens pharmacies across Arizona. It had conducted, by its own count, approximately 890,000 tests per year. Its board of directors included 2 former secretaries of state, 2 former secretaries of defense, a former Senate Majority Leader, and a decorated 4-star Marine general. It survived multiple rounds of investor skepticism. It survived questions from the Food and Drug Administration. It survived whistleblowers, internal warnings from its own scientists, and a decade of missed technical milestones. The company charmed one of the most powerful collections of political and military figures ever assembled on a corporate board. And then it fell. Not slowly, not gracefully. In pieces, rapidly, under the weight of a single newspaper investigation. How does a company valued at $9 billion, backed by some of the most powerful names in America, collapse in under 3 years? And what was actually happening inside those walls, in the locked laboratories where employees were told never to discuss their work, not even with colleagues sitting in adjacent rooms? Those are the questions this documentary sets out to answer. Before we go any further, if you are finding this story compelling, leave a comment below and let us know what drew you in. Are you watching because you remember when this company was in the headlines, because you have a personal connection to this kind of fraud? Your thoughts matter. If you are not yet subscribed, please do so now. We cover stories exactly like this one, where the gap between a company's public image and its private reality turns out to be catastrophic. Chapter 1. The Girl with the Plan and the Patent. Elizabeth Ann Holmes was born on the 3rd of February 1984 in Washington, D.C. Her father, Christian Holmes IV, worked for the United States Agency for International Development. Her mother, Noel, was a congressional committee staffer. By any measure, the family was comfortable, educated, and connected to the machinery of American public life. She grew up partly in Washington and partly in Houston, Texas. By the accounts of people who knew her as a child, she was bookish, solitary, and intensely self-directed. She had few close friends. She spent long hours reading, designing things in notebooks, dreaming up products that did not yet exist. At 9 years old, she was apparently designing her own version of a time machine. At the age of 13, she told her father what she wanted most for Christmas: an encyclopedia. She wanted to read all of it. She was not, by conventional accounts, a natural social creature. But she had something that many socially fluid children lack: an almost frightening certainty about what she intended to accomplish. She told relatives from an early age that she intended to become a billionaire. Not wealthy, not successful, a billionaire. The word was specific. The goal was already fixed. As a teenager in Houston, she displayed her first real entrepreneurial move. She learned Mandarin Chinese, studied enough to become conversational, and began selling C++ compiler software to universities in China, all while still in secondary school. The venture was small and ultimately inconsequential in financial terms, but the instinct it revealed was significant. She was already thinking about reaching customers who were being underserved in markets that larger companies were ignoring. In 2002, at 18 years old, Holmes participated in a Mandarin language program facilitated by Stanford University. The trip took her to Beijing. There, she met a Pakistani-born software entrepreneur named Ramesh Balwani, known by the nickname Sunny, who was 37 years old at the time. He was also married, though that marriage would not last. Holmes was a recent high school graduate. The two became friends. That friendship would eventually become something far more complicated and far more consequential. Holmes enrolled at Stanford University the same year, studying chemical engineering. During her freshman year, she took a summer internship at the Genome Institute of Singapore in 2002, where she worked on research related to the SARS outbreak that was then tearing through Asia. She returned to Stanford with a specific technical idea forming in her mind: a small patch that could test blood for infectious diseases and simultaneously administer medication, adjusting dosage in real time. She filed a patent application in 2003, her first year at Stanford. Stanford professor Phyllis Gardner, a specialist in clinical pharmacology, met with Holmes that same year. Holmes pitched her the idea. Gardner told her, directly and without ambiguity, that what she was describing was not scientifically possible. The human body does not absorb drugs in the precise, calibrated way Holmes was imagining. The skin is not a reliable membrane for the kind of testing she was proposing. Gardner said, "The idea will not work." Holmes heard the words. She did not accept them. She took the idea instead to Channing Robertson, a dean at the Stanford School of Engineering, who had a different reaction. Robertson believed in Holmes personally. He became, effectively, her first champion, and eventually the first member of Theranos' board of directors. Robertson was a credible scientist with a credible reputation. His willingness to back Holmes gave the company early credibility that it could not otherwise have earned. In 2003, using the money her parents had set aside for her Stanford tuition, Holmes dropped out of her sophomore year and founded a company she initially called Real-Time Cures. The name was quickly changed. She felt it was too presumptuous, too overt, too easy to dismiss. The new name was Theranos, a compressed combination of the words therapy and diagnosis. She was 19 years old. She had no scientific degree. She had no completed product. She had a patent application for a device that her own university professor had told her was impossible, a modest amount of family money, and a certainty so total that it appeared to many people who encountered it indistinguishable from genius. By the end of 2004, she had raised $6 million in venture capital. The building that housed Theranos in those early years was a modest space in Palo Alto, California. The operation functioned in what Silicon Valley calls stealth mode. No website, no press releases, no public presence of any kind. Holmes insisted on layers of secrecy so dense that even her own employees were prohibited from discussing their work with colleagues in different parts of the building. Departments were siloed. Laboratory workers did not know what the engineers were doing. The engineers did not know what the scientists were discovering. The secrecy was explained as protection of trade secrets. It served an additional purpose, which would only become clear years later. It made the company nearly impossible to evaluate from the inside. What the investors who funded those first $6 million did not know, what almost nobody knew until much later, was that Holmes had already been told by qualified scientists at one of the world's most prestigious universities that her core idea did not work. She had filed that knowledge away and continued anyway. Chapter 2. The Machine That Would Change Everything. By 2007, Theranos had raised enough capital to be valued at $197 million. It was still operating in secrecy. It still had no public product. The company had grown its investor base through a series of private pitches in which Holmes presented herself not merely as an entrepreneur, but as a visionary, someone who would democratize medicine, who would bring the kind of blood testing available only in hospital laboratories directly into pharmacies, supermarkets, and eventually people's homes. The pitch was emotionally and intellectually compelling. Holmes said she had a fear of needles since childhood. She said she had watched a close family friend suffer through an illness that might have been caught earlier with more accessible diagnostic testing. She said that in the United States, tens of millions of people avoided going to the doctor, not because they were unwell, but because testing was expensive, painful, and time-consuming. She intended to change all of that with one compact machine. That machine was eventually called the Edison, named after Thomas Edison, another autodidact, another American dreamer who operated outside established scientific institutions. The naming was intentional. Holmes idolized Thomas Edison. She also idolized Steve Jobs. She hired designers who had worked at Apple to create the Edison's physical appearance. The machine was sleek. It was compact. It looked revolutionary. What the Edison was supposed to do was extraordinary. Collect 2 to 4 drops of blood from a fingertip using a small lancet. Transfer that blood into a tiny tube called a nanotainer, and then run dozens of diagnostic tests on that sample. Tests for cholesterol, diabetes, HIV, cancer markers, thyroid function, delivering results in under 4 hours. No venous draw, no laboratory visit, no waiting room. In 2005, Holmes hired Ian Gibbons to be the company's chief scientist. Gibbons was 55 years old, British-born, and had earned a PhD in biochemistry from the University of Cambridge. He had spent 30 years working on diagnostic technologies at companies in the United States. He was named on nearly 200 patents during his career. He was, in every measurable sense, one of the most qualified people in America to assess whether what Theranos was trying to build was technically achievable. From his first days at the company, Gibbons understood the magnitude of the technical challenge. The Edison worked in some limited sense for some tests, but for the vast majority of what Holmes was claiming it could do, the machine failed to produce accurate results. The amount of blood available from a fingerstick was simply insufficient for many of the assays Holmes was promising. The company's devices showed what scientists call high variance, results that differed significantly from what standard laboratory equipment would produce for the same sample. Gibbons raised these concerns. He raised them to Holmes directly. He raised them to other senior staff. He told his wife Rochelle, in a phrase that would later be quoted in John Carreyrou's book Bad Blood, that nothing at Theranos is working. Holmes's response was to keep the concerns internal, to classify the failures as engineering problems that would eventually be solved, to continue presenting the technology to investors and potential partners as though it functioned as claimed. In 2009, Ramesh Balwani, Sunny, formally joined Theranos as its president and chief operating officer. He and Holmes were by this point in a romantic relationship, though Holmes concealed this from her employees and board of directors. Balwani had made a significant amount of money during the dot-com boom of the late 1990s. He had run a software company. He had no background in medicine, biochemistry, or laboratory science. Employees would quickly discover that he did not understand the processes in the lab. What Balwani contributed was a management style that former employees would later describe uniformly and consistently as terrifying. He was known internally as an enforcer. He had a fierce temper. He demanded results. When scientists told him the technology was not performing as Holmes had promised, he did not commission more research or seek external expertise. He pressured them to find a way to make the numbers work. Multiple employees later described a culture of fear so pervasive that raising legitimate scientific concerns felt professionally suicidal. In 2010, Theranos entered into a partnership with Safeway, the American grocery chain, worth more than $350 million. Safeway began retrofitting more than 800 store locations with patient service centers in preparation for the Theranos testing service that was, they were told, almost ready to launch. Safeway spent years waiting for a technology that would never arrive in the form it had been promised. The same year, Theranos raised a further $45 million in investor capital. By 2010, the company had raised close to $50 million in total, all of it from private investors who had never been permitted to see a working demonstration of the Edison under controlled conditions. What almost nobody knew at the time was that Holmes had already been warned by multiple qualified scientists both inside and outside the company that the Edison could not reliably do what she was telling her investors it could do. The internal failures were kept behind walls so thick and a culture of secrecy so total that even senior employees did not know what was happening in adjacent laboratories. Chapter 3. The Moment the World Believed. In 2013, something shifted. After a decade of operating entirely in the shadows, Elizabeth Holmes and Theranos stepped into the light. The company launched a public website. Holmes began giving interviews. She appeared in the pages of Fortune, Forbes, and Inc. magazines. She delivered talks at major conferences. She became, almost overnight, one of the most celebrated figures in Silicon Valley. and Silicon Valley had not seen anyone quite like her before. She was a young woman in an industry dominated by men. She wore black turtlenecks almost exclusively in a clear and conscious homage to Steve Jobs. She spoke in a deep, unhurried baritone, a voice that former colleagues would later confirm was deliberately affected, trained to project authority in a room full of older men. In a 2023 interview with the New York Times, Holmes spoke in her natural voice for the first time publicly. It was notably higher. She confirmed the lower register had been a performance. The performance was extraordinary. Holmes possessed an almost supernatural ability to make people believe. She was calm. She was visionary. She never hedged. She never expressed doubt. When she said that Theranos would bring laboratory blood testing within 5 miles of every American household, she said it as though this was not a goal, but an inevitability, a fact about the future that already been settled. In late 2013, Theranos announced a partnership with Walgreens. The drugstore chain, which operated more than 8,000 locations across the United States, would offer Theranos blood testing at its wellness centers. The first Theranos service centers opened in Walgreens locations in Arizona in 2013. Patients could walk in, have a fingerstick test performed, and receive results within hours. The price was dramatically lower than traditional lab testing. The irony, and it is the most precise kind of irony, the kind that removes any sense of accident, is that Theranos was not, in most cases, using its Edison machines to run those tests. The Edison was being used for only a small fraction of the company's assays. The majority of tests were being processed on conventional laboratory equipment made by third-party manufacturers. Equipment that Theranos had purchased and installed in its Newark, California laboratory. Equipment that any competing laboratory could have bought from a catalog. Holmes had built a $9 billion company, assembled a board of national legends, secured partnerships with 2 of America's largest retail chains, and raised close to $1 billion from private investors, all on the basis of a machine that, in real clinical use, was running only a fraction of the tests she had promised. By 2014, Forbes was valuing Holmes's personal stake in Theranos at $4.5 billion. She was 30 years old. She was appearing at the World Economic Forum in Davos. She was testifying before Congress on healthcare innovation. She was a cover story, a keynote speaker, a cultural symbol. And her investors were still waiting for the technology to work. The board of directors that George Shultz had helped assemble was a roster that read like a diplomatic who's who. Former Secretary of State George Shultz himself, former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, former Secretary of Defense William Perry, former Secretary of Defense James Mattis, then a retired 4-star Marine General, former Senate Majority Leader Bill Frist, who was also a heart surgeon, former Senator Sam Nunn, Richard Kovacevic, former Chief Executive of Wells Fargo, Riley Bechtel, former chairman of the Bechtel Group. What this board had in abundance was prestige. What it entirely lacked was expertise in clinical diagnostics. Not a single member had a background in laboratory science, in biomedical engineering, or in the regulatory landscape of medical device development. They were there to open doors, to provide access, and to lend the company a credibility that its technology had not yet earned. At board meetings, Holmes presented slides. The slides were, it would later emerge, filled with false claims claims that Theranos technology had been validated by the FDA and the World Health Organization, neither of which was true. General Mattis testified at Holmes's trial that Holmes was his primary and, effectively, his only source of information about the company and its technology. He had no independent means of verifying anything she told him. In 2011, Holmes had told investors and officials that Theranos devices were being used by the United States military in medevac helicopters on active battlefields. This claim was false. The Department of Defense had tested Theranos technology and found it unsuitable for military use. Holmes eventually recanted the battlefield claim, but only when pressed by investigators under oath, years after she had made it. The investors believed. Walmart's founding Walton family invested $150 million. Media mogul Rupert Murdoch put in more than $120 million. Former Secretary of Education Betsy DeVos contributed $100 million. Oracle co-founder Larry Ellison invested as well. None of them had seen a peer-reviewed scientific study. None of them had been permitted to review primary testing data. Theranos did not publish peer-reviewed research. It cited trade secrecy. The secrecy was real. What it was protecting, however, was not innovation. It was failure. Chapter 4. The Science That Would Not Cooperate. By 2013 and 2014, there were people inside Theranos who knew the machine was not working. Several of them tried to do something about it. Tyler Schultz was the grandson of George Schultz, board member, former Secretary of State, and one of Holmes's most devoted champions. Tyler began working at Theranos in 2013, fresh out of Stanford University, where he had studied biology. He was 22 years old. He admired Holmes. His own grandfather spoke of her in terms that bordered on reverence. Within months of beginning at the company, Tyler Schultz discovered something troubling. The results coming from the Edison machines were not consistent with results produced by conventional laboratory equipment run on identical samples. The variance was not marginal. It was, in some cases, significant. He witnessed something that a fellow employee called the repeat and delete methodology. If a test result looked anomalous, it was simply run again. If the second result was different, one of the results was deleted. The anomalies were made to disappear. This is not how science works. A result that does not fit the pattern is, in science, the most interesting result of all. Schultz raised his concerns with management. He was told he was wrong, or that the issue was under review. He eventually went to Elizabeth Holmes directly and emailed her a detailed account of what he had observed, including statistical inconsistencies in the company's quality control data. Holmes's response, as Tyler Schultz later recounted, was to question his competence. She forwarded the email to Ramesh Balwani. Balwani summoned Schultz to a meeting. It did not go well. Schultz resigned from Theranos shortly afterward, but he did not stay silent. Erica Cheung was a laboratory assistant at Theranos from 2013 to early 2014. She had joined the company because she was captivated by Holmes's vision, by the idea of making healthcare more accessible. She had spent 6 months in the company's laboratories before she, too, began to see the pattern. She watched data outliers being deleted from quality control records. She saw faulty results being overwritten. When she had her own blood tested on a Theranos Edison machine, the result indicated a serious vitamin D deficiency. A standard laboratory test run on the same sample showed her levels were normal. Cheung brought her concerns to Balwani. Balwani questioned her scientific understanding. She left the company. And then Theranos did something that would become a defining feature of how it dealt with dissent. It sent private investigators to follow her. The culture of intimidation at Theranos was not incidental. It was structural. The company employed the law firm Boyes, Schiller, Flexner, led by David Boyes, one of the most feared litigators in the United States. Employees who threatened to speak were confronted with non-disclosure agreements, threats of lawsuits, and, in at least one case, the experience of arriving at a meeting expecting to talk privately with Holmes and finding themselves surrounded instead by lawyers holding legal papers. At the center of all of this was Ian Gibbons. He was still at Theranos. He was still raising concerns. He was still watching his attempts to achieve scientific accuracy be overridden, dismissed, or buried. In 2007, he had been diagnosed with colon cancer. He had undergone chemotherapy and multiple surgeries. He stayed at Theranos partly because, as a cancer patient, he needed the health insurance. By 2013, Gibbons was in an impossible position. He knew what the technology could and could not do. He knew the company was making claims it could not support. He could not prove it publicly without violating his non-disclosure agreement. And then, in May 2013, he received a subpoena. A lawsuit involving a former business associate of Holmes required his testimony. The prospect of testifying, of being asked under oath questions about Theranos's technology, was, by his wife Rochelle's account, terrifying to him. He knew what he would be asked. He knew what he could not honestly say. On the evening of the 16th of May, 2013, Gibbons received a phone call from a Theranos assistant saying that Holmes wanted to see him the following morning. His wife recalled that he was certain he was about to be dismissed. He did not go to work the following morning. He was found at home and taken to a hospital, having attempted to take his own life. Ian Gibbons, Ph.D. in biochemistry from the University of Cambridge, whose name appeared on nearly 200 patents, and who had given 8 years of his life to a project he knew could not work as described, died in hospital on the 23rd of May, 2013. Holmes did not return the phone calls from Rochelle Gibbons in the days that followed. The first contact Rochelle received from Theranos after her husband's death was from a company office manager asking her to return company property. That detail, quiet, administrative, utterly without grace, tells you something essential about what was happening inside this company. It was not failing to do what it promised because of honest scientific uncertainty. It was failing because the people running it had, somewhere along the way, made a choice. They had decided that the vision was more important than the reality, that the story was more important than the science. And they had made that choice with other people's lives. If you are watching this and thinking about a family member who went through a health scare in the mid-2010s, or a friend who had testing done at a Walgreens in Arizona during those years, stay with us. The next section is where things get even more serious. Also, if you are not yet subscribed, now is a good moment. We cover exactly these kinds of stories, where corporate governance fails, where scientific fraud hides in plain sight, and where ordinary people pay the price. Subscribe now so you do not miss what comes next. On the 2nd of October 2015, the front page of the Wall Street Journal carried an investigation by reporter John Carreyrou. The headline stated, in plain terms, that Theranos had been using conventional laboratory equipment, not its own Edison machines, to run the vast majority of its blood tests, and that the Edison, for the tests it did run, produced results that were unreliable. Carreyrou had been working on the story for months. He had been contacted by Tyler Schultz, who had already, using a false name, filed a complaint with the New York State Department of Health about Theranos's clinical laboratory practices. Schultz had eventually agreed to speak to Carreyrou on the record. Erica Chung had also spoken to Carreyrou. Multiple former employees had confirmed, across separate and independent conversations, the same essential fact. The Edison did not work as claimed. Theranos's response to Carreyrou's investigation before publication had been to send lawyers a cease and desist letter, a demand that the journal kill the story. When that failed, the company denied everything. Holmes appeared on CNBC's Mad Money the day after the story broke and said, with her characteristic unflinching composure, "This is what happens when you work to change things. First they think you're crazy, then they fight you, and then all of a sudden you change the world." She was quoting a sentiment often attributed loosely to Mahatma Gandhi. She deployed it with the precision of someone who had rehearsed it. She did not answer the specific allegations about the Edison. She did not produce data. She said, in effect, that the story was an attack by people who feared disruption. Walgreens paused the expansion of its testing centers, but did not immediately terminate the relationship. The Cleveland Clinic offered to independently verify Theranos technology. Theranos declined. Safeway had already quietly terminated its partnership earlier that year, after years of missed deadlines and results that failed to impress during internal testing. Then came the federal investigators. In January 2016, following an on-site inspection completed in November 2015, the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, known as CMS, sent Theranos a formal deficiency report. The subject line read, "Condition-level deficiencies, immediate jeopardy." The finding stated that the laboratory's deficient practices pose immediate jeopardy to patient health and safety. That phrase, immediate jeopardy, is one of the most serious designations available to American federal health regulators. It means that the agency has determined that patients face a significant risk of serious injury or death as a result of what is happening inside the facility. One of the specific findings related to tests for warfarin, the blood-thinning medication used by millions of cardiac patients to prevent stroke. Warfarin has a very narrow therapeutic window. Too little, and a patient faces clot risk. Too much, and they risk serious internal bleeding. Accurate warfarin monitoring requires highly precise blood testing. Theranos was running warfarin tests on its Edison machines. The results were dangerously inaccurate. Doctors in Arizona had already been receiving corrected reports from Theranos. In at least one documented case, a physician in the Phoenix area had sent a patient to the emergency room based on Theranos test results, only to discover later that the results were wrong. The CMS report documented months-long stretches of quality control failures. In October 2014, 29% of quality control checks on the Edison failed to meet Theranos's own internal standards. In February 2015, a test using the Edison to measure testosterone levels failed quality control checks 87% of the time. In May 2016, Theranos acknowledged that it had voided 2 years of Edison test results from 2014 and 2015. The company said the voiding affected roughly 1% of its tests. The number of corrected reports sent to doctors and patients ran to the tens of thousands. For each of those tens of thousands of reports, there was a person who had received a result and then received a correction. Some had made no medical decisions on the basis of the original. Some had. Some had taken medication. Some had stopped taking medication. Some had undergone procedures. Some had been told they might have cancer, or that they probably did not, on the basis of a result that turned out to be meaningless. The director of Theranos' laboratory in those final years, Kingshuk Das, testified at Holmes' criminal trial. Das said he had voided every single test run on the Edison device from the years 2014 and 2015, and that he had explained to Holmes directly that the instruments were not performing from the very beginning. Das testified that when he presented his concerns to Holmes, she offered him an alternative explanation. It was not an instrument failure, she told him. It was a quality control issue. This is a distinction without a clinical difference. The patients receiving incorrect results did not care whether the machine was broken or the quality control was inadequate. They needed accurate results. They did not receive them. Chapter 6. The Walls Come Down. In March 2016, the CMS announced its intention to impose sanctions on Theranos that would include revoking the Newark Laboratories clinical certification and banning both Holmes and Balwani from owning or operating any clinical laboratory for 2 years. In April 2016, federal prosecutors and the Securities and Exchange Commission opened criminal investigations. Holmes appeared before congressional committees. The House Committee on Energy and Commerce demanded information on what corrective actions the company was taking. The company provided answers that satisfied no one. In May 2016, Walgreens formally terminated its partnership with Theranos and closed the remaining Theranos wellness centers in its stores. Walgreens had spent $140 million on the partnership. It would eventually reach a settlement with Theranos for less than $30 million, recovering barely a fraction of what it had invested. In July 2016, CMS revoked Theranos' Clinical Laboratory Improvement Amendments certification, the federal license required to operate a medical laboratory, and issued a civil monetary penalty. Holmes was barred from operating a certified clinical laboratory for 2 years. Without a laboratory license, Theranos had no business. The core product was gone. The company announced in October 2016 that it would lay off approximately 40% of its workforce, 340 people, and would pivot, it said, to developing a different kind of miniaturized testing device called the Mini Lab. In January 2017, Theranos announced a further round of redundancies. 155 more people. The last blood testing facility was closed after failing a second major federal inspection. At its peak in 2015, Theranos had employed more than 800 people. By early 2017, fewer than 200 remained. Most of those who left the company were scientists, laboratory technicians, engineers and administrators who had joined because they believed genuinely that what Holmes was building could improve healthcare. Many of them had relocated to California. Many of them had turned down offers from other companies. Some had been working for years in a laboratory that they had been told was changing medicine, only to discover that it had been producing fraudulent results since the day it opened. In March 2018, the Securities and Exchange Commission charged Holmes and Balwani with fraud, alleging that they had raised more than $700 million from investors through a scheme that involved exaggerated or false statements about the company's technology, business, and financial performance. The charges included the false claims about military deployment of Theranos devices, the false assertions about FDA and WHO validation, and the wildly overstated revenue projections. The company had told investors it expected to generate approximately $1 billion in revenue in 2015. The actual revenue that year was negligible. In 2014, when the company told investors it would generate over $100 million, it made $100,000. Holmes settled with the SEC on the 14th of March 2018. She surrendered voting control of the company, returned 18.9 million shares, and agreed to a $500,000 fine. She was barred from serving as an officer or director of any public company for 10 years. 3 months later, in June 2018, the United States Department of Justice indicted both Holmes and Balwani on federal wire fraud and conspiracy charges. 11 counts in total. Theranos announced its dissolution that September. The company, $9 billion, 800 employees, a board of national statesmen, partnerships with 2 of America's largest retailers, nearly $1 billion in private investment, was dissolved. It sent an email to its investors. It would pay remaining creditors with whatever cash remained. The machines were silent. The laboratories were empty. Chapter 7. The Trial, the Verdict, the Prison. The pandemic delayed both trials. Holmes's criminal trial finally began in September 2021 in the federal courthouse in San Jose, California. She was 37 years old. She pleaded not guilty to all 11 counts. Her defense was, in its essentials, this: she had believed in the technology. She had not set out to commit fraud. She had been a true believer who got in over her head, and much of the wrongdoing, the suppression of concerns, the intimidation of employees, the falsified projections, had been driven by Ramesh Balwani, to whom she claimed, been in an abusive relationship. She accused Balwani of emotional and sexual abuse. Balwani denied the allegations. The trial lasted 4 months. Witnesses testified to the precise mechanisms by which Theranos had deceived investors. The forged partnership documents bearing the logos of pharmaceutical companies that had not endorsed the technology. The false slides presented to the board claiming FDA and WHO validation. The battlefield deployment lie. The revenue projections fabricated from wishful thinking. Dr. Kingshuk Das testified that Holmes had been told explicitly that the Edison machines had never performed accurately. Former laboratory director Adam Rosendorf testified that Holmes had been aware of quality control failures and had continued to operate the laboratory regardless. Former Theranos employee Erica Chung took the stand and described the repeat and delete methodology she had witnessed, the systematic erasure of inconvenient results. Dr. Kingshuk Das testified that Holmes had been told explicitly that the Edison machines had never performed accurately. Former laboratory director Adam Rosendorf testified that Holmes had been aware of quality control failures and had continued to operate the laboratory regardless. Former Theranos employee Erica Cheung took the stand and described the repeat and delete methodology she had witnessed, the systematic erasure of inconvenient results. Former General James Mattis testified as well. He described Holmes as his sole source of information about the company's technology. He presented the slide deck she had given the board, the one claiming FDA and WHO endorsement that never happened. On the 3rd of January, 2022, the jury returned its verdict. Holmes was found guilty on 4 counts, 3 counts of wire fraud against investors and 1 count of conspiracy to commit wire fraud against investors. She was acquitted on 4 counts related to defrauding patients. The jury returned no verdict on the remaining 3 counts, and the judge declared a mistrial on those. She was found not guilty of the counts related to the patients, the people who had received inaccurate blood test results, the people whose doctors had made medical decisions on the basis of those results, the people who had experienced agonizing uncertainty about their own health status because of a machine that its creators knew did not work. That acquittal on the patient fraud counts is the detail that is hardest to sit with. In November 2022, U.S. District Judge Edward Davila sentenced Holmes to 11 years and 3 months in federal prison. He also ordered Holmes and Balwani to pay $452 million jointly in restitution to the victims of their fraud. Balwani was tried separately. In July 2022, he was convicted on all 12 counts, every charge against him. In November 2022, he was sentenced to almost 13 years in federal prison. The harsher sentence reflected, in part, his greater experience running businesses and the more prominent role he had played in creating the culture of fear and suppression. On the 30th of May 2023, Elizabeth Holmes reported to Federal Prison Camp Bryan in Bryan, Texas, a minimum security facility for women located approximately 95 miles northwest of Houston. She arrived at approximately 12:30 in the afternoon, wearing a tan cardigan and jeans. She was accompanied by her parents and her partner, Billy Evans. She left behind 2 young children, a son born in July 2021, a daughter born in late 2022. In February 2025, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals rejected her appeal and affirmed her conviction and sentence. Her projected release date, accounting for standard good conduct reductions, is December 29, 2032. Chapter 8. The Silence and What Remains. How did the most well-funded fraud in Silicon Valley history escape detection for 12 years? The question you heard at the start of this documentary, the one about what was actually happening inside those walls, now has a complete answer. The walls were the point. The secrecy was the product. The board was the alibi. The vision was the anesthetic. And the culture of fear was the mechanism that kept everyone who knew the truth too frightened to speak until it was almost too late. Holmes had constructed a company that was perfectly designed to conceal failure. The secrecy that she presented to investors as trade secret protection prevented any independent verification of the technology. The board that she assembled to provide credibility had no relevant scientific expertise and no independent access to the laboratory data. The non-disclosure agreements that employees signed bound them legally, even when they knew that patients were receiving false results. And the law firm on retainer made crystal clear what the consequences of speaking out might be. What the second question was asking: how did so many powerful, intelligent people fail to see it? Has a more uncomfortable answer. They did not look closely enough, because the story was too good. The vision of democratized, painless, cheap blood testing was not just a good business proposition. It was a moral proposition. It spoke to something people genuinely wanted to be true. Investors who might have demanded peer-reviewed data, independent laboratory validation, or a credible scientific advisory board instead looked at a 29-year-old woman in a black turtleneck standing in front of slide decks, speaking in a baritone about changing the world, and they believed. The building that once housed Theranos' main office at 1701 Page Mill Road in Palo Alto, California, is currently occupied by other technology tenants. The Newark, California laboratory where the Edison machines sat in their padlocked rooms has since been repurposed. There is no plaque. There is no memorial. The physical traces of Theranos are gone. What persists is harder to see. It persists in the FDA's Office of Criminal Investigations, where Special Agent George Skavdis spent 6 years documenting the experiences of more than 70 doctors and patients, people who had received wrong results for cancer markers, for warfarin levels, for HIV, for diabetes. He described their testimonies as providing a crystal-clear picture of how Theranos misled and harmed an untold number of people. The number of patients affected has never been officially determined. There were approximately 890,000 tests conducted per year from the Theranos Newark laboratory alone. The number of incorrect results that led to incorrect medical decisions may never be fully calculated. The two whistleblowers who took the greatest personal risks to expose the company have continued in work that reflects what they learned at Theranos. Erica Cheung founded Ethics in Entrepreneurship in 2020, a non-profit that provides resources for investors, entrepreneurs, and employees who need to recognize and respond to ethical failures in early-stage companies. Tyler Schultz founded his own biotech company, Flux Biosciences, focused on reproductive health, and has spoken at universities and business schools around the world about the experience of being a whistleblower inside a company whose founder had once been his family's friend. Rochelle Gibbons, the widow of Ian Gibbons, told an interviewer after the guilty verdict that she found a small measure of satisfaction in the result, though she remained concerned that Holmes would avoid meaningful prison time. Holmes did not. But Rochelle's husband, who spent 8 years trying to make a device work that could not work as described, who raised those concerns and was silenced at every turn, who died in May 2013, knowing that the company he had given his scientific life to was deceiving its patients. Ian Gibbons did not live to see the verdict. He did not live to see the sentences. He did not see the day the Edison machines were carted out of the locked laboratory and the CMS certification was revoked. The irony at the heart of this story is as precise as any in recent American business history. Elizabeth Holmes built a company on the premise that blood holds all the answers, that a few drops, properly analyzed, could reveal the full truth of what is happening inside a human body. She was right about the premise. She was catastrophically dishonest about whether she had achieved it. Who is responsible? The list is long, and it is distributed. Holmes made the core decisions. Balwani enforced them. The board provided legitimacy without scrutiny. The investors provided capital without verification. The regulatory system that is supposed to govern medical devices allowed a company to operate clinical laboratories for years while avoiding the kind of peer-reviewed validation that any comparable technology would have been required to produce. The Silicon Valley culture that celebrates the willingness to fake it till you make it provided the philosophical framework that allowed Holmes to rationalize, or perhaps to genuinely believe, that the deception was temporary, that the technology would eventually catch up to the promises. They had every tool available to prevent this. The science was there, the regulatory framework was there, the whistleblowers spoke up. The facts were available to anyone who asked the right questions. Someone had to choose not to ask them. John Carreyrou, the Wall Street Journal reporter whose investigation brought the company down, spent months being threatened with lawsuits. He published anyway. His book, Bad Blood, Secrets and Lies in a Silicon Valley Startup, published in 2018, is the most complete account of what happened inside Theranos. It remains one of the best accounts of how a corporate fraud is sustained, not through the silence of everyone, but through the overwhelming of everyone who speaks. If you received blood tests at a Walgreens in Arizona between 2013 and 2016, those results are now a matter of legal record. If a doctor near Phoenix received a corrected Theranos report in 2016 and called a patient to tell them their earlier result might have been wrong, that moment happened. It happened tens of thousands of times. The people on the receiving end of those phone calls have mostly never been named publicly. They are not in the trial transcripts. They are not in the documentaries. They are the most important part of this story. If you worked at Theranos as a scientist, a laboratory technician, an engineer who tried to make the Edison function and could not, we want to hear from you. If you were a patient who received a Theranos test result, whether corrected or not, tell us what that experience was. If you know someone who made a medical decision on the basis of those results, tell us. Write in the comments where you are watching from, and what part of this story hit you hardest. The conversation that matters most about Theranos is not the one between lawyers in a San Jose courtroom. It is the one between people who lived through it.